This is rather special for us because we have a very distinguished guest with us, Professor John Mearsheimer. You all know him very well. And we also have our own emeritus professor, İlter Turan, who will be moderating it. I'm sure that we will have a very lively session because he has written a book this year about states and their foreign policies. And I'm sure he'll be touching upon that as well as recent events around the world. So with that just brief introduction, I'll pass the buck to my dear friend, Ambassador Fatih Ceylan.
Thank you very much indeed, dear Selim. I should like to extend my gratitude on behalf of Ankara Policy Center to both Professor Mearsheimer and Professor İlter Turan for their participation in our joint webinar today. As a realist myself, insofar as it applies to international politics, I have been a keen follower of Professor Mearsheimer for more than a decade. His analyses and views and books on particularly the ongoing conflict in Ukraine are extremely important and certainly deserve praise. I'm confident that Professor Mearsheimer would also consider sharing his views on the unfolding tragic events in Gaza and their consequences for the region and the global security landscape. Sincere thanks once again to both our guests. And with his indulgence, I now pass the floor to Professor İlter Turan. Professor, please, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Actually, let me just insert a footnote that our distinguished speaker did write a book years ago on the Israeli lobby and how they exercise maybe more influence than usual in American politics. But let me introduce our speaker, which is indeed a privilege for us to have. He is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. And he has often been called the most influential realist of his generation. And he has put forth this offensive realism doctrine, arguing that interaction between great powers is primarily driven by the rational desire to achieve regional hegemony. And that's maybe why the United States and China may be destined for a clash in the future. Just to introduce him briefly in terms of his educational background, he was initially trained as a soldier at the U.S. Military Academy, which he left in 1970. Then he got a master's in international relations from the University of Southern California. Professor, did you maybe study with Jim Rosenau?
I did.
Yeah, that's what I suspected. All right. And then a PhD from Cornell University. And he has been in the teaching profession since that time. But apart from his teaching, Professor Mearsheimer is noted as a person who is always willing to share his views with the public. And he is always carefully listened to, not always agreed with, but, certainly a fresh, clear-thinking person in American politics. And I should say, I would join the ambassadors, Yenal and Ceylan, that it is indeed a privilege for us to have you. It is my understanding that the distinguished professor plans to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we shall engage in an open question-answer period, or maybe I could reterm it as an exchange of ideas, including questions. So please, Professor Mearsheimer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I wish I was in Ankara itself instead of doing this by Zoom, but that is not the case.
We'll do that too in the future, if that's a promise on your part.
Okay, thank you. The subject I was asked to talk about today are the two big wars that are taking place, one, Ukraine, and two, the war in Gaza. And what the consequences of those two wars are for relations between the West and the rest, or between the West and the global South. And of course, this is an issue that has huge importance for Turkey. After all, Turkey is geographically located very close to both conflicts, the one in Gaza and the one in Ukraine. And furthermore, Turkey, although it's generally considered to be part of the West, really in a way, from my perspective, has a foot in both camps, the Western camp and the rest camp. So what's going on in the world with regard to these two conflicts really, I think, matters to Turks greatly. My basic argument is that, first of all, when you talk about the West, you're really talking about the United States. The United States drives the train. That's certainly true in the Middle East, but it's also true with regard to Ukraine. NATO is dominated by the United States. And so the United States is what really matters, and what we want to pay a lot of attention to is American policy. And my argument is that from a Western perspective, or from an American perspective, the Ukraine war has turned out to be a disaster. And the war in Gaza is turning out to be a disaster as well. But not only are these two conflicts disastrous in terms of the course that they are on, in my opinion, there is little chance that there will be any resolution of these two conflicts that will bring peace to each of the two areas of the world. These are going to be festering problems, and I'm talking about Ukraine and Gaza. Both are going to be festering problems for the foreseeable future. And this is going to hurt the West, and especially the United States, in terms of its relations with the rest of the world. So all of this is to say, from an American perspective, the United States is in real trouble. Let me first deal with the Ukraine war and then turn to the war in Gaza. With regard to the Ukraine war, 2022 was a good year for the Ukrainians and for the West. As you all know, the war started on January 24th, 2022. And for pretty much the rest of that year, it looked like Ukraine was going to defeat the Russians inside of Ukraine. The Ukrainians and the West more generally are going to win a victory. The Ukrainians won two significant tactical victories during the course of 2022. One was in Kharkiv and the other was in Kherson. In both cases, the Russians withdrew from big slices of territory, and the Ukrainians moved in and took over that territory. And many in the West, and of course in Ukraine as well, hypothesized, based on those tactical successes and the poor performance of the Russian army, that in 2023, the year that is now coming to a conclusion, the Ukrainians would do very well. They would continue their successes. And these successes, coupled with economic sanctions, would deliver a hammer blow to the Russians. This was the basic view about a year ago in the West. But things have not worked out that way. And in fact, 2023 has seen the tide turn in the Russians' favor. And the Russians have actually done very well in 2023. And it appears that they're going to win an ugly victory in the end. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? Well, first of all, there was a huge battle for Bakhmut in the first half of 2023. And the Ukrainians made it clear they were going to throw in huge amounts of resources to make sure that they didn't lose in Bakhmut. But the fact is, the Ukrainians lost in Bakhmut. Russia paid a significant price to capture Bakhmut, but in the end, it succeeded. Then, after the Bakhmut conflict came to an end, the Ukrainians launched the famous counteroffensive on June 4th of this year. And as you all remember, it was widely expected in the West that the Ukrainians would do very well against the Russians. And this would seal a Ukrainian victory because the Russians would be badly staggered and incapable of winning the war. The counteroffensive that was launched on June 4th and lasted until the early fall was a total disaster for the Ukrainians. The Russians stymied the Ukrainians at almost every turn. And in the process, the Ukrainians suffered enormous casualties. They suffered much greater casualties than the Russians did. And now we are at a point where the Ukrainians are in real trouble because they have a manpower shortage. And more importantly, they don't have the weaponry to fight in a successful way moving forward. And I'll say more about this in a minute. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, why was Ukraine successful in 2022? And what happened to turn the tide in 2023? It's actually quite simple. And the first point you want to keep in mind is that this is a war of attrition. This is a case of two armies standing toe-to-toe and trying to bleed each other white. The June 4th counteroffensive was actually designed to avoid a war of attrition. And basically what the Ukrainians and the West thought could happen on the battlefield was that the Ukrainians could launch a blitzkrieg, a classic blitzkrieg against the Russian defenses and drive all the way to the Sea of Azov and in effect win a quick victory, a quick and profound victory. That's what we thought would happen. But obviously that didn't happen, and we remain stuck in a war of attrition. And the question you want to ask yourself when two countries are involved in a war of attrition is, what determines who wins that war? And there are really two indicators that you want to look at. And if you think about it, these two indicators make perfect sense as harbingers of who is going to win the war. The first is the balance of population. How many people do the Ukrainians have and how many people do the Russians have? What is the relative size of the two populations? And the fact is that at this point in time, the Russians have a 5-to-1 advantage in population. That means that in terms of mobilizing troops to fight a war, the Russians will inevitably enjoy a 5-to-1 advantage in manpower on the battlefield. And as you all can figure out rather easily, if one side has 5 soldiers and the other side has 1 soldier, for every 5 the other side has, the side that has more soldiers, that has 5 soldiers for every 1 soldier the other side has, is going to prevail in the conflict in all likelihood. The second indicator you want to look at is the balance of artillery. Artillery is the key weapon in a war of attrition. Artillery is what kills soldiers on both sides. When I went to West Point long ago, we were taught that artillery is the king of battle, and it is certainly the king of battle in a war of attrition. Very importantly, the Russians have somewhere between a 7-to-1 and a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery at this point in time. So you see that what you have here is you have a balance of power that favors Russia over Ukraine. Russia has 5 times as many people and therefore is going to end up with 5 times as many troops on the battlefield, assuming both sides mobilize their forces in a full-scale way. And furthermore, the Russians have a huge advantage in artillery and other weapons as well. Now, very importantly, take this a step further, the problem that the Ukrainians have is that they don't have a meaningful industrial base of their own. So they can't produce weaponry for themselves that's sufficient for success on the battlefield. So the Ukrainians depend heavily on the West for equipment. They depend heavily on the West for artillery tubes, artillery shells, tanks, and so forth and so on. The Russians, on the other hand, have a formidable industrial base, significant manufacturing capability, and the ability to produce huge amounts of artillery, huge numbers of tanks, huge numbers of aircraft, huge numbers of helicopters, huge numbers of drones, so forth and so on. So you have this situation where these two armies, right, are different in size, number one, and two, where one is outgunning the other because it has much more equipment. This explains what happened in 2023. In 2022, the Russians had a rather small army. Many people make the argument, many people in the West, that the Russians invaded Ukraine with the intention of conquering all of Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. This is a myth. The Russians actually invaded Ukraine with a remarkably small army. I argue that it had 190,000 men in it at most. There are a number of very smart people who think that the Ukrainian army had at most 100,000 troops. This is a very small army. And this is the principal reason that the Russians did not do very well in 2022. They had a small army. It had a lot of problems that had to be worked out. But at the same time, the Ukrainians had a quite formidable military because the West had been training and arming the Ukrainians since 2014, when the crisis first broke out. So the balance of power over the course of 2022 between the Russians and the Ukrainians was slightly in favor of the Ukrainians. However, what happened in late September of 2022 is that Putin mobilized 300,000 men. And then over the course of this year, 2022, he hasn't mobilized more men, but huge numbers of men have been joining the Russian army. The estimate is that 480,000 men will join the Russian army by the end of this year. So you had that 300,000 plus that were mobilized in late September 2022, and then in 2023, 480,000 new men are coming into the army. These people are being trained up, and they're being armed with lots of artillery, and they're being armed with lots of tanks and other kinds of weaponry because the Russians have the capability to produce those weapons. The West, on the other hand, does not have the capability. So the Ukrainians now are outnumbered in terms of soldiers, number one, and number two, they don't have the equipment to match the Russians. Furthermore, when you look at the casualty exchange ratio between the two sides, the Ukrainians have been suffering much greater casualties than the Russians have. And that's due in large part to the fact that the Russians have much more artillery, and artillery is the king of battle. And when you look at the summer counteroffensive and you think about the Ukrainians being on the offensive, getting out of ditches or trenches and moving forward in the open and being exposed to Russian artillery fire and air power, it's no accident that the Ukrainians have suffered greater casualties than the Russians have. So the end result of this is that the Russians are now in very good shape, and the Ukrainian military is in terrible shape. And on top of all this, the West now is lost interest in providing economic support for Ukraine. So it is very hard to see how Ukraine is going to prevail in this conflict. And at the same time, it's easy to see how the Russians are likely to prevail, how the Russians are likely to win an ugly victory. My argument here is that what will happen is that the Russians will end up conquering another 4 oblasts, in addition to the 4 oblasts in Ukraine that they have already conquered and annexed, plus Crimea, which they have conquered and annexed. So I think that Ukraine probably now controls somewhere on the order of 23% of Ukraine. And when all is said and done, Russia will control probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of Ukraine. And at the same time, what's left of Ukraine will be a dysfunctional rump state. It's very important to understand that the Russians will want to make sure that Ukraine is weak and that it stays badly damaged so that it's not capable of either joining NATO or presenting any form of meaningful military threat to Russia. So again, what I predict the end game to look like here is a frozen conflict, not a peace agreement, a frozen conflict where Russia controls probably about 40 or so percent of what had been Ukraine before 2014, and Ukraine itself ends up as a dysfunctional rump state. And just to talk a little bit about the consequences before I move on to the Middle East. The West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, but the West is not going to accept this situation. The West and Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in those areas that it's annexed, and to figure out ways that Ukraine can get back the territory that it's lost. Ukraine will think that that lost territory belongs to them and that they should figure out a clever way to get it back. The Americans will be deeply committed to doing everything they can to weaken Russia and put Ukraine in a position where Ukraine can take advantage of Russian weakness. The Russians, for their part, will go to great lengths to keep Ukraine weak. As I said, the Russians will go to great lengths to cause trouble in Europe itself. They'll do everything they can to undermine the EU and undermine NATO, and the Russians will go to great lengths to undermine transatlantic relations. All of this is to say, after you get a frozen conflict, you're likely to have an intense competition between Ukraine and the West on one side and Russia on the other side. This is not going to lead to a peaceful Europe. Just finally, you want to remember, and I think most of you know this very well, that there are a number of potential flashpoints between the West and Russia in the general area of Eastern Europe besides Ukraine. In other words, most of my discussion up to now is focused on Ukraine and the fact that the war in Ukraine, even after it ends and turns into a frozen conflict, might heat up again and turn into a war once more. But it's not only Ukraine that we have to worry about. We have to worry about conflict breaking out over the Black Sea. We have to worry about conflict breaking out over Moldova. We have to worry about conflict breaking out over Belarus. Think about what's going to happen when Lukashenko leaves in Belarus. The West will probably try to effect a color revolution in Belarus, just as it tried to effect the color revolution. You remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This is not going to make the Russians happy, and this could lead to all sorts of trouble. So we have the Black Sea, we have Moldova, we have Belarus, and then there's the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is now surrounded by all NATO countries except for Russia. The Baltic Sea matters greatly for Russia yet it's surrounded by all these NATO countries. There's real potential for conflict there. And then finally, there's the Arctic, where the ice is melting and competition is heating up in the Arctic. In the Arctic, there are 8 different countries that are physically located in that area of the world. 8 countries. 7 of them are NATO countries. The other country that is not a NATO country, of course, is Russia. The potential for trouble in the Arctic is great, just as it's great in the Baltic, in Belarus, in Moldova, and in the Black Sea. So all of this is to say that the trouble revolving around Ukraine that we have seen since 2014 is not going away anytime soon. And this, of course, is not good news for Turkey or for anyone else for that matter. Now, let me switch to the subject of the Gaza war. And here we're mainly talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been an ongoing conflict for a long time now. The key starting point is to understand that the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. That's not going to change anytime soon. It's in large part due to the Israel lobby here in the United States. The Israel lobby is a remarkably powerful interest group, and it goes to great lengths to make sure that the United States and Israel are on the same page on almost every issue. It goes to great lengths to make sure that the United States provides Israel with unconditional support. And the fact is that it is remarkably difficult for any American president to put any pressure on Israel to move to a two-state solution or to change its policies towards the Palestinians on any particular issue. So you want to always keep in mind that Israel and the United States work together when it comes to dealing with the Israel-Palestine issue, which of course is the taproot of the problem in the Gaza war. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. What caused this conflict on October 7th? Basically, it was a consequence of the occupation. The Israelis are determined to create a greater Israel. And a greater Israel involves what we used to call Green Line Israel, Israel before the 1967 war, plus the West Bank, plus the Gaza Strip. These 3 big areas all comprise greater Israel. And the Israelis do not want to create a two-state solution, because a two-state solution would involve giving the Palestinians control over Gaza, control over the West Bank, and control over East Jerusalem. That would be the core of a Palestinian state. The Israelis have no interest in a Palestinian state. The Israelis want a greater Israel. The problem that the Israelis face is that there are roughly as many Palestinians as there are Israeli Jews living inside greater Israel. The numbers are roughly 7.3 million Palestinians and 7.3 million Jews. And in a situation like that, right, it's impossible to have a democracy, because if you have a democracy, the Palestinians, given present birth rates, will eventually outnumber the Israeli Jews, and Israel will cease to be a Jewish state. So you can't have a democracy from an Israeli point of view, and they don't want a two-state solution. What they want is a greater Israel. And the greater Israel that they envision causes all sorts of problems because you have so many Palestinians inside of that greater Israel. So the question is, what are the 2 options, or what are the options that the Israelis have for dealing with this Greater Israel, dealing with the Palestinians who live inside this Greater Israel. They have two options. One is apartheid, and that's what the occupation is really all about. Or two, they can ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank. Now, up until the war broke out on October 7th, basically you had an apartheid system in Israel. That's what the occupation was. It was an apartheid system. And what happened on October 7th is that the Palestinians, and here we're talking mainly about Hamas, although Hamas was not the only group inside Gaza that was involved in the offensive on October 7th, but Hamas and these other groups effectively broke out of this giant open air prison that they were in, and they attacked the Israelis and killed significant numbers of Israeli civilians and killed significant numbers of Israeli soldiers. The Israelis are now retaliating. They have launched a massive bombing campaign, and at the same time, they are trying to destroy Hamas. What exactly is going on? My view is that the Israelis are deeply interested in expelling the Palestinians from Gaza. I believe their principal goal is to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and if they can, to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank as well. The primary interest of the Israelis is ethnic cleansing. But it does not look like at this point in time that that is going to succeed, despite the fact that the Israelis have gone to great lengths to make Gaza unlivable. At this point in time, it does not look like the Palestinians will be driven out. So ethnic cleansing does not appear to be working, which is certainly all for the good. But what does that mean for the future? What that means is that you're going to have a return to the same. You're going to have an apartheid state. You're going to have a greater Israel that contains huge numbers of Palestinians, and the Israelis are going to deal with those Palestinians by brutally suppressing them in places like the West Bank and places like Gaza. Many people are now talking about affecting a two-state solution, pushing the Israelis to accept a two-state solution once the war is over. The war in Gaza is over. I don't believe that's going to happen. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that you can get a two-state solution. But I do not believe the Israelis are at all interested in the two-state solution. In fact, they have made that perfectly clear. And as I said to you at the start of my comments on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the United States backs Israel unconditionally, and the United States is not going to put pressure on Israel in any meaningful way to move to a two-state solution. So you're not going to get a two-state solution. You're not going to get democracy. And if you don't get ethnic cleansing, which hopefully you will not get, then the only alternative is more apartheid. And that applies to Gaza, of course, and it applies to the West Bank. And the end result of this is that this conflict will go on and on. It will poison relations between Israel and countries all over the planet, to include Turkey, and it will poison relations that the United States has with countries all over the planet, in large part because there is so much unhappiness outside the West with what the Israelis are doing. And not only will Israel be condemned for what it is doing to the Palestinians, but the Americans will be condemned for supporting the Israelis. So to conclude, my basic bottom line here is that the United States and the West more generally are in deep trouble in Ukraine. Their dreams in 2022 of defeating the Russians have gone up in smoke. And in fact, the Russians are now in the driver's seat in Ukraine. And furthermore, as I tried to emphasize, if you think about the future with regard to Eastern Europe, there are all sorts of reasons to worry deeply about further escalation. And with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict, there is, I am sad to say, and again, I hope I'm wrong, that there is no good reason to think that the basic situation in Greater Israel is going to change and that you're going to find a political solution to this terrible problem. So all of this is to say, I have no good news, only bad news to present you this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer. Indeed, you constructed a very lucid, very cogently formed argument. And I think the overall mood of this audience is probably at the moment rather pessimistic. But let me see if there are others who think differently. And I will open the floor for questions. In our tradition, usually the moderator starts with a question, but in this particular case, I don't think there's any need for me to lead the way. I'm sure there will be many colleagues who will be ready to ask questions. So I'll just say the floor is open. Please put your hand up on the computer so that I can see it, because I may fail to see you raising your hand since I don't see everyone at the same time. Please
One announcement, Professor, if I may.
Yeah.
This will be recorded. This is being recorded and will be viewed on YouTube. So I just wanted to let you know that this is the case when you ask your questions.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very helpful reminder. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, questions, anyone? I see Attila Çelebi. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. So first of all, I would like to thank the Professor Mearsheimer. Pleasure to be able to ask you questions as a person. We saw your name in every week, basically, in school, and to the GIF crew who make this opportunity a possibility. So my question basically relates to this pre-war structural realist expectation of Russia and United States eventually aligning at the same camp against the rising China. So what would be your take on the role of this new war on these expectations? Do you still believe this is a valid possibility, or the war tilted the balances? Thank you.
Yes, my view is that there are three great powers in the world. We're now in a multipolar system. We have transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. The three powers are the United States, China, and Russia. The United States is by far the most powerful country in the world at this point in time. But China is a peer competitor. Russia is not. China has the military and economic wherewithal to dominate all of Asia, which is unacceptable to the United States. The United States does not want another regional hegemon. The United States wants to be the only regional hegemon in the world. We are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. We do not want China to dominate Asia. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. Russia does not have the potential to dominate Europe. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is not a peer competitor of the United States. China is. Now, if you're the United States and you're deeply committed to preventing China from becoming a regional hegemon, you want to be allied with the other great power in the system. If you're the Americans, you want to be allied with the Russians against the Chinese. The last thing you want to do is drive the Russians into the arms of the Chinese so that the Russians are helping the Chinese, because the Chinese are your main concern. the Chinese are the peer, China is the peer competitor. What the United States has foolishly done through its policy toward NATO expansion into Ukraine is driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is a violation of balance of power politics 101. Furthermore, to make the situation worse, because the United States is bogged down in Ukraine and now bogged down in the Middle East as well, it is not in a position to fully pivot to East Asia to contain China. Again, you want to understand that from the United States' point of view, the principal threat on the planet is China. The principal threat on the planet is China dominating Asia. So therefore, it's imperative that the United States pivot fully to East Asia to contain China. But because of what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, it's impossible for us to fully pivot. And to get back to the original point, in addition, we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is just evidence of how foolish American foreign policy has been for a very long time.
Thank you. Ambassador Ceylan, please. Yes.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Mearsheimer. It's indeed been a very rather horizon-opening views that you have shared with our audience today. My question is, under present rather bleak situation in Ukraine, how could you conceptualize potential elements of a peace deal that could emerge in the mid to long term? What, in your opinion, should be injected into that process? I'm talking about possible elements of compromise or peace. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Ambassador. I could tell you what I think is a plausible deal, but nobody would accept it. So I don't think it's likely to happen. And that's why I think we're going to get a frozen conflict rather than a genuine peace deal. But if you wanted a peace deal now, I think that, first of all, Ukraine and the West would have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed the 4 easternmost oblasts that are now part of Russia, and Crimea as well. Ukraine would have to accept that that territory is lost. That would mean accepting the fact that about 23% of pre-2014 Ukraine is gone. And the second thing that Ukraine would have to do is it would have to sever all ties with NATO. It would have to agree to be a genuinely neutral state. And that would mean it could not have any security arrangements with the West. I think the Ukrainians would also have to limit their military capability somewhat. I think that it would be very difficult for the Russians to accept a fully armed Ukraine over time. But anyway, again, just to sum up, Ukraine would have to accept the fact it's lost 4 oblasts plus Crimea. It would have to move to a genuinely neutral position and give up all security relationships with the West, including NATO, and there would have to be some disarmament. I think that's the only way at this point in time you could convince the Russians to cut a peace deal. The problem that the Russians face is that if they trust the West and they give Ukraine the ability to stay well armed and to have a security relationship with the West, there is always the danger that somewhere in the future, Ukraine will want to relaunch the war. So what the Russians want to do is put the Ukrainians in a position where they can never relaunch the war against Russia. And that means severing all security ties between Ukraine and the West and making sure that Ukraine is not heavily armed. That, I think, is the only way you avoid a frozen conflict and you get a genuine peace deal. And I don't believe that Ukraine or the West would accept those arrangements.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Göğüş, please, yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your very enlightening explanations. My question is, the two ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza, how will they affect the presidential elections next year? Will they play to the hands of President Biden or Trump?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me just say as a preface that it's a long time before the election and a lot of things can happen. It's therefore not always easy to predict, what will happen months away in a presidential election in the United States. But leaving that qualifier aside, I think what's going on is going to badly hurt Biden. I think that if he loses in Ukraine, which I think is inevitable, that's going to look terrible for him. And I think with regard to the Middle East, he's in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. He's backing the Israelis to the hilt. There's no question about that. But the end result is that he has alienated the Arab American community. And there are huge numbers of people in the Arab American community who say they just will not vote for Biden. They may not vote for Trump and probably won't vote for Trump, but they're not going to vote for Biden. And this really matters in a swing state like Michigan. Michigan has a large Arab American community, and it's a very important state for Biden if he hopes to get reelected. And it does not look like he's in good shape in Michigan. And I think that he's going to be in trouble elsewhere as well. There's lots of evidence that many Americans are terribly upset with American policy in Gaza. So I think that's going to hurt him. Now, one could argue that what's going to happen in the months ahead is that President Biden is going to put pressure on Israel to move to a two-state solution. And he's going to put pressure on Israel to accept a ceasefire. I don't think that he'll put meaningful pressure on Israel. But I think if he puts any pressure on Israel, the Israel lobby will be terribly upset, and they will criticize him and work against him to make sure that he does not put significant pressure on Israel and that Israel basically gets its way. So you see that Biden, if he sides with the Palestinians in any way, gets clobbered by the lobby. And if he sides with Israel down the line, then he suffers with the Arab American community, and he suffers with lots of other voters in the United States as well. So I think if you look at what's going on both in Ukraine and in Gaza, I think it's good news for Donald Trump, assuming that Trump and Biden are the two contenders next November. So I think Biden has been hurt, and maybe badly hurt, by his conduct of foreign policy with regard to these two wars.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Göktürk, please. Yes. Şafak Bey. Do you hear me, Ambassador Göktürk? Okay, we'll come. Şafak Bey, do you hear me?
Seems he's frozen.
He's frozen. All right. Mr. Erdoğan, you go ahead, and then when Mr. Göktürk comes back, we will get him back on the air. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First, I want to thank this chance to be able to ask a question to Professor Mearsheimer. It's a great privilege. Just as Attila described, seeing your work, reading you, just for the last 4 years of my life. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity. So my question is that, shall I go on?
Yeah, go on.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. My question is that I'm thinking about United States support to the Israel. You mentioned about the things that United States might lose in due to the Israeli lobby in Washington. But is there a relative gain or an absolute gain of United States in this? If the conflict goes on, like does United States act on the basis of the potential losses, or do we have any perception of gaining something from this conflict?
I think that it's quite clear that what is happening in the Middle East now is not in America's strategic interest. The United States has a deep-seated interest in having stability in the Middle East. And the United States does want to concentrate on East Asia. It wants to concentrate on dealing with the China problem. It doesn't want to be deeply involved in conflict in the Middle East. And, when I talked about the Hamas versus Israel situation today, I focused mainly on Gaza and what's going on in Gaza. But as you know, there's a serious threat of horizontal escalation. It would not be surprising if a war broke out between Hezbollah and Israel. They're already engaged in all sorts of exchanges of fire with artillery and rockets and so forth and so on, aircraft. So we could have a full-scale war involving Hezbollah and Israel, and the United States absolutely does not want that. There are all sorts of problems in the Red Sea now with shipping. There's the danger of Iran coming into the war and the United States ending up fighting in the Middle East against Iran. There are all sorts of groups that are attacking American forces in Iraq and in Syria. As you all know, the Americans have small contingents of military forces in both Iraq and Syria, and there are groups that are attacking them. So the potential for escalation is great here. And this is not in America's strategic interest. Just let me come at this from a slightly different angle. Going back to President Jimmy Carter, every president, including Carter, has been deeply committed to a two-state solution. The United States understands, American leaders understand that there is no military solution to the Palestinian problem, right? The only solution is a political one. The Palestinians need a state of their own. And that's why American presidents since Jimmy Carter, every one of them has been interested in pushing a two-state solution. However, it's been impossible for the United States to put really serious pressure on Israel to move to a two-state solution because the Israel lobby makes it impossible to do that. All of this is to say a two-state solution is in America's strategic interest. Presidents have recognized that for a long time now. It is not in our strategic interest to have Israel as an apartheid state. And it is not in our interest to have this conflict going on in Gaza now and all of the other problems going on in the West Bank. It causes us all sorts of problems, strategic problems. So Israel is not a strategic asset for the United States.
Thank you very much. Shafak Bey, do you hear me? Shafak Göktürk, Ambassador.
Yes.
Right.
Ambassador Göktürk,
Okay.
your
Okay, let's
voice
go
is
with, yeah.
coming
Can
very,
you
very
hear me now?
a little bit higher, please.
Can,
Could you turn up
can
your
you hear me
microphone?
now?
Yes, yes, but you have to speak a little louder, yes.
Yeah.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
so you can hear me.
Yeah.
Mr. Mearsheimer, I was still ambassador in Cairo in 2009 when I grabbed your book you co-authored with Stephen Walt on the Israeli lobby. That was quite enlightening. And since then, I have been following your articles, and they have been helpful in understanding how the things go from superpowers academic perspective. Now, two very quick questions. One is about, you talked about proportions of power between Russia and Ukraine. How would you explain the Afghanistan example, where the proportions were much more in favor of Russia, and the result was, as we know? And when it comes to the Middle East, what do you think about the abiding effect of 7 October? Because this was a jolt for the Israelis, and not only for the radicals, for Israel as a nation. And I think it changed things in many different ways. It changed the Israeli policy for the last 16 years. They stopped using Gaza and Hamas as a useful tool, and they decided to do away with it. And this impacts on the situation in the West Bank. And also, we are now in a different context than the time when the Oslo agreements were drawn, and then when the Arab uprisings took place, and Israel felt a free hand to do what it would wish to in terms of its security, and devouring West Bank was concerned. But that has changed because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has all now keeping that dispute as is will no longer serve the purpose of keeping the status quo there, given the jittery nature of the Palestinian question has come back, and has come back in a big way. It is also trying to find have a sustainable. When it comes to the role of China, I think it is different again in many different ways, in many ways from Russia's. To start with, the tools they employ to exert influence in the Middle East couldn't be more different. That is, those employed by China and Russia. And I think China has an interest to have a more stable Middle East, unlike Russia. And there, maybe the United States and China may find some common ground. What would you think about this kind of a calculus? Thank you.
Okay, you raised a lot of points, which I could talk 2 hours about. So I'm not going to cover all of your points, but I'll try to cover what I thought were the two main points. First of all, with regard to Russia in Ukraine versus Russia in Afghanistan, what you want to understand is that the Russia-Ukraine war is a conventional war. It's a case of two armies.
Excuse me, Professor. Someone has their microphone open. It's generating noise. Would you turn your mics off, please? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, the Russia-Ukraine war is a conventional war. It's two conventional armies fighting each other out in the open. The Russia-Afghanistan war was the Russians dealing with an insurgency. It's a completely different kind of war. And if Russia goes into Afghanistan and has to fight an insurgency, it's going to lose. If Russia goes against a weaker power like Ukraine in a conventional war, it's going to win. Let me give you the American let me give you some American examples that point this out. You all remember the 1991 Gulf War, when the United States defeated the Iraqi army. That was a conventional war. It was two large armies out in the open. The Americans are going to win every time. Think about the Americans in Afghanistan. The Americans were there for 20 years and they lost. Why did they lose? Because they were up against an insurgency. And great powers rarely do well against insurgencies. This, by the way, is the problem that the Israelis face in Gaza. They're not up against a Hamas army that has tanks and artillery pieces. This is not a conventional war. The Israelis are dealing with insurgents. And they're not, in my opinion, going to end up defeating Hamas. It's just not going to happen. With regard to your second point, I think you were saying, and I agree with you, that from Israel's perspective, the situation in terms of dealing with the Palestinians in Gaza has changed in some important ways. I think you're right. I think before October 7th, the Israelis believed that they could manage the problem. The Israelis fully understand or understood before October 7th that they had a real problem with the Palestinians. They understood there were huge numbers of Palestinians in their midst, and they understood that those Palestinians did not like living in an apartheid state. But the Israelis believed that they could manage the situation. You often heard that rhetoric. And they thought they were managing the situation very well in Gaza with Hamas. Hamas and the Israelis were, to some extent, working together. The Israelis liked Hamas because Hamas was not interested in a two-state solution, and Hamas was a good way of dealing with the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, and Mahmoud Abbas was interested in a two-state solution. So the Israelis were playing a divide and conquer strategy, or employing a divide and conquer strategy with their relations with Hamas and their relations with the Palestinian Authority. But that's all over with now. The Israelis, are now determined to decisively defeat Hamas. My argument is they're not going to decisively defeat Hamas, and that they're going to end up having to occupy, in all likelihood, Gaza. They won't occupy all of Gaza, but I believe that they will end up occupying part of Gaza, at least for some lengthy period of time. And the end result is it will be much more difficult to manage the problem. Furthermore, international opinion is now much more attuned to the Israel-Palestine conflict than it was before October 7th. People are paying attention to this issue. They're going to continue to pay serious attention to this issue, and an enormous amount of time and effort is going to be spent on trying to figure out how to solve the problem. And the Israelis are going to be a major obstacle to solving the problem, because people around the world are going to want to push for a two-state solution, and the Israelis are going to contest that. And the Americans are going to be caught in the middle. And it'll be very messy. So I think that moving forward, Israel post-October 7th is going to have serious problems managing the Palestinian problem. And I would just add to that, and this point should not be underestimated, before October 7th, when there was not a significant problem managing that problem, Israel still had wicked internal problems. Remember, there were significant protests against the Netanyahu government, and there was lots of talk in the Israeli media about a possible civil war. Now, this did not involve the Palestinians. all of this is to say you had powerful centrifugal forces inside of Israel before October 7th. And now, on top of those powerful centrifugal forces, which have not gone away, you have this really problematical situation regarding how Israel is going to deal not just with Gaza, but with the Palestinian problem more generally.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Cengiz Bey, please.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much for an excellent, enlightening speech. Please forgive this question coming from an engineer, but is the US superiority sustainable in the two-polar arena of industry and technology, which is going to go through major disruptions in the next decade?
Look, I think that American military power, American power, depends heavily on remaining on the cutting edge of developing sophisticated technologies. The United States cannot allow China to dominate cutting edge technologies. The United States has to remain the #1 country on the planet in terms of developing quantum computing, artificial intelligence, super chips, and so forth and so on. There's just no question about that. I think your point is that it's not clear that the United States will be able to do that because the Chinese have demonstrated that they have a remarkably impressive ability to produce cutting edge technologies. So what we have here is an arms race that's taking place, not with regard to military weaponry, but an arms race regarding sophisticated technologies. And the question you have to ask yourself is, who's going to win? And the answer is, I think, probably the United States, but I'm not sure. The Chinese are formidable competitors, and anybody who's spent any time in China, as I have, and has seen the economic miracle there, knows that you should not underestimate the Chinese. Furthermore, if you look at the political system in the United States, it's quite dysfunctional at this point in time. And one could make the argument that this dysfunctional political system will hurt our ability to compete with regard to cutting edge technologies. I don't think in the end that will prove to be the case, but I'm not sure. So my bottom line is, I think we are going to prevail, but I'm not sure I'd bet a lot of money on that.
Thank you. Bozkurt Bey, sizin eliniz galiba yukarıdaydı, şimdi indi. Şey mi?
Ben isterseniz sorayım. Bir sorum vardı.
Buyurun. Hayır. Siz
Thank you.
arzu
It was a magnificent expose that you have done. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Professor. My question is very hypothetical. And if the Ukrainian leaders had been more, how to say, mature, and if they had a long history of relationship with Russia as a sovereign state, would they have engaged in this kind of a war and accept the inducement, let's say, of the Europeans and Americans to be at the war front with the Russians? Or would they have decided otherwise and accepted 23% loss of their territory? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think what happened in the American case is that when the Cold War ended in 1989, and then when the Soviet Union broke apart in December 1991, we found ourselves, we meaning the Americans, found ourselves as the most powerful state in the world by far. And there was a sense of triumphalism in the West that's now hard to appreciate because things have gone badly since the early 1990s. But as you and I both remember, as almost everybody here remembers, in the early 1990s, the Americans believed that we had won and that we had the wind at our back. In other words, the world was going to look more and more like the United States, more and more like the West. And this sense of triumphalism and this sense that Russia, or the Soviet Union, which became Russia, had lost the Cold War, put us in a position where we thought we could run around the world and tell other people what their political system should look like, how they should conduct their foreign policy, because we knew better. Madeleine Albright summed it all up when she said, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller. We see further." So you want to just understand that from the American perspective, you had this worldview that was very condescending towards other countries. And in my opinion, was guaranteed to get the United States into a lot of trouble. Now, the area where the United States had focused most of its attention during the Cold War was Europe. And NATO was considered to be this brilliant alliance that had allowed us to win the Cold War, and that we should continue not only to maintain, but we should expand eastward to include more countries. And this was inextricably bound up with the sense of triumphalism that we had. We had won, we were successful. This alliance, NATO, really mattered. And what we should do is just march it eastward. And of course, lots of people said in the 1990s that this was going to get you into serious trouble with the Russians. People like George Kennan and William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, they all said NATO expansion is a bad idea. It's going to poison relations with the Russians. But the problem is, we had this sense of triumphalism, this sense that we knew better, and we were remarkably powerful, so we could get our way. We could expand NATO into Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999. In 2004, we could expand NATO into the Baltic states, into Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth and so on. And the Russians couldn't do anything because they were too weak. So when we talked about expanding NATO into Ukraine and into Georgia, and the Russians said no, our reaction was, who are the Russians to say no? We are the indispensable nation. We do what we want. And furthermore, we were remarkably powerful. And as I said, that power had allowed us to expand NATO in 99. It had allowed us to expand NATO in 2004. So we thought we could just shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. This is what happens in April 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit. The Russians make it very clear when we announce that Ukraine and Georgia are going to become part of NATO, that that's not going to happen. That's what the Russians say. That's not going to happen. The Russians say explicitly that they will destroy NATO, destroy Ukraine before they let it become part of NATO. But we don't listen to them. We don't listen to them because we're the indispensable nation and we are remarkably powerful. So we continue to push and push. As you know, the crisis breaks out on February 22nd, 2014. This is when the Ukraine crisis breaks out, 2014. What does the United States do? It doubles down. Does it back off and say Russia has legitimate security interests that we should take into account? No, because that's not the way the United States thinks during the unipolar moment. We are the indispensable nation, and we are remarkably powerful. So instead of backing off after 2014, we double down. And then when Joe Biden moves into the White House in January 2021, he doubles down even further than his predecessor, Donald Trump. And it's no accident that a year later, things go to hell in a handbasket. But it's just very important to understand that the United States was not interested in listening to what the Russians had to say about their security concerns. The United States did not think NATO was an existential threat. And if Russia thought it was an existential threat, that was simply because Russia was misguided. And we were so powerful that we would get our way in the end. But it all blew up in our face on February 24th, 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine. And by the way, you want to remember, I'm sure everybody in the audience, given this is a Turkish audience, knows this very well, but the Russians and the Ukrainians were negotiating in Istanbul after the war started. And it looked like there might be a possible deal. The Israelis were involved too. Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was involved. The Turks were involved. And it looked like progress was being made to shut this conflict down, which certainly would have been all for the good. But what happened? The Americans and the British, and here, of course, we're talking mainly about the Americans moved in and they told the Ukrainians to stop negotiating with the Russians and to continue fighting. This was a remarkably foolish way of doing business. But I think the Americans just overestimated how powerful we are in terms of pushing our agenda on other countries, and how committed other countries around the world are to pursuing their own national interest. It was just, I think the Americans have always been like that, right? We've always had that sense that we're the city on the hill. But I think the triumphalism that came with the end of the Cold War and the arrival of unipolarity magnified that tendency. And it got us into a whole heck of a lot of trouble, as you well know. And by the way, I don't have to tell you this, but it strained U.S.-Turkish relations at various points since 1989, when the Cold War ended.
Thank you. Ambassador Yener, yes.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, reading your books, of course, you talk about great power politics and realism. I'd like to ask you the role of leaders. What role do they really play, especially now that there's a possibility of a second Trump administration? How much would he follow U.S. interests that you are, mentioning here? Because we know after seeing his first administration that the second one could be much different than what he has done so far. So, how much role do you give to leadership in these great power politics?
Yes, another great question. My theory of international politics does not pay any attention to leaders. It basically says the structure of the international system determines in large part how states act. Nevertheless, leaders do matter. I would not argue that they're irrelevant, although they're not part of my theory. My argument is most of the time, they do not matter very much. I think that there are some exceptions. I think that Napoleon and Hitler are the two most glaring exceptions of leaders who mattered in truly important ways. But I think for the most part, leaders are of marginal importance, okay? Now, this brings us to the Trump issue. Now, Trump, when he was elected in 2016, and then became president in January 2017, wanted to do all sorts of things to, in effect, radically alter American foreign policy. I believe that Trump wanted to have good relations with Vladimir Putin, And I believe that Trump wanted to pull American forces out of Europe and put an end to NATO. He was not able to do that. He was not able to pursue many of the foreign policy initiatives that he favored. And by the time he left office, he felt quite frustrated by the ability of what we call the blob. The blob is a term to depict the American foreign policy establishment. In other words, the American foreign policy establishment, or the deep state, or the blob, was able to thwart Donald Trump on almost every issue. The one exception is actually China. He did fundamentally change U.S. Policy toward China, but that was not difficult to do because China had become so powerful by 2017 that most Americans in the establishment were willing to go along with Trump. Now, your question is, what happens if he wins in 2024 and he moves into the White House in January 2025? And it's very important to understand that the Heritage Foundation, which is closely associated with Trump, has formulated a program called, I think, Heritage 2025. And this program is designed to put together a team of advisors who operate on the same wavelength as Trump. In other words, they share Trump's views of the world. And the aim here is to make sure that when Trump gets into the White House, of course, we're assuming he wins here, that when Trump gets into the White House in January 2025, the deep state or the blob or the foreign policy establishment will not be able to thwart him, to check him the way they did in 2017 to 2021. It's going to be different this time because he's going to have his own advisors who have clear-cut policies that are in sync with what Donald Trump wants to do. Now, the $64,000 question, getting to the heart and soul of the question that I was asked, is whether or not I believe the structure of not only the international system, but the structure of the American political system is such that they will stymie Trump again. My belief is that even if he brings in a new team that is more attuned to his way of doing business, this is Trump's way of doing business, they will not have that significant an effect on American foreign policy. I believe the structure of the international system and the structure of the American political system make it almost impossible for Trump to really change policy in a fundamental way that is at odds with what the establishment wants. Now, we'll see whether I'm right. I may be wrong. I'm, not saying that leaders never matter. As I told you, there are cases in history where leaders had a quite profound influence on how a state's foreign policy played itself out. Trump may be a case of someone who is so cunning and so powerful that he is able to do things that another president would not be able to do. But my bottom line is that Trump won't make that big a difference. Oh, by the way, just while I'm on talking about this, Trump talks about if he gets elected, he's going to go talk to Putin, and he and Putin will shut down the Ukraine conflict in a matter of days, if not one day. He talks like this. This is not going to happen. This is not a serious argument. Vladimir Putin is not going to trust Donald Trump any more than he trusts Joe Biden. And he's not going to be willing to cut a deal with Donald Trump that's any different than the deal he would cut with Joe Biden. And if Donald Trump tries to come up with some sort of innovative deal that the Ukrainians don't like, the foreign policy establishment doesn't like, the European governments don't like. He's not going to be able to cut that deal. So all of this just is sort of evidence for why I think that Trump won't matter that much.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we're just about out of time. So Ambassador Rende and Mr. Çolak and Kibaroğlu, please ask your questions in sequence, and then I will have the last word to Professor Mearsheimer again. So might I ask you simply to direct your very brief questions to the distinguished professor. Thank you very much. Ambassador Rende.
Professor, with respect to the Ukrainian war, you highlighted the weaknesses of Ukraine and the strength of Russia, while some defense experts and others, they argue that Russia has its own weaknesses. For example, they don't hold the moral high ground as occupiers and as a country destroying its neighbor. And then their troops are not motivated. The Russian establishment is not supported by the Russian people. And finally, also, they argue that with the expected weaponry and the F-16s and the missile systems to be received by the Ukrainians, they might hit and destroy the choke points in Crimea and avoid and prevent, for example, the Russians from providing logistics to their forces in Ukraine. So I would be grateful if you could maybe just comment on these arguments. Thank you.
Thank you. Çolak, yes, Mr. Çolak. We're not hearing you, Mr. Çolak.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Do you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. Dear Professor, very nice to meet you, actually. I haven't read your books, but I will fill that gap very quickly. I sign everything that you said about Ukraine and Russia. I will put my signature, whatever you have said. Actually, when you get closer to Moscow, you will be in trouble. It has been always the same throughout the history. I beg to differ a little bit when it comes to Gaza, because after all these turmoil and all these events, I think the greater Israel will be achieved, and I don't think that there will be a Gaza split. I wouldn't say anything about the West Bank, but Gaza and Hamas will be eliminated eventually, because I won't get into details. But really, it was a great opportunity for me to listen to you, and I will fill that gap. I will start reading your book. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Mustafa Kibaroğlu, please brief.
Thank you, Professor Turan, and thank you, Professor Mearsheimer. I'm teaching course on arms control, disarmament, and proliferation, non-proliferation in Turkey since 1997, and Iran's nuclear program has been one of my main subjects. And I've been studying this subject, and my view is that Iran wants to get to the point of getting the bomb, but they are still waiting because the environment is not ready for that. So do you think they want the bomb? Or if you do think that, what kind of circumstance may pave the way for their detonation? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Honorable Professor, there has been a barrage of questions. So, of course, since you are the master of time, you're at liberty to use as much time as you want.
Yeah, I will fully answer all three questions.
Very good. Very good.
With regard to the first question, which in a sense challenged me on Ukraine, the balance of power between Ukraine and Russia, making the argument that the Russian army has some significant weaknesses and there is reason for hope for Ukraine. I would argue that every army has weaknesses. There's no question about that. And the Russian army is not the German Wehrmacht in 1940. There's just no question about that. Excuse me, but I think the Russian army has significantly improved over the past year. And all sorts of Ukrainian soldiers, high-level commanders, and to the very top of, and I'm talking here at the very top of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny, for example, and all sorts of soldiers down in the lower grades have commented on how much better the Russians have performed in 2023 than they did in 2022. So this is a competent army. And as I said in my formal presentation, the Russians have mobilized huge numbers of soldiers, and huge numbers of soldiers have joined the Russian army, and they have been quite well trained. So this is a reasonably well-trained army, right, that has grown in competence over time and is doing quite well on the battlefield. Now, it's also important to understand that Ukraine is in real trouble. Ukraine has suffered enormous casualties, right? And furthermore, the Ukrainians are not able to implement a large-scale mobilization. There is so much draft dodging, avoiding military service in Ukraine, that the government feels that if it tries to institute a draft or to mobilize another huge wave of soldiers to replace all those soldiers who were killed in the counteroffensive this summer, that it will cause all sorts of domestic turmoil. So you just want to keep in mind that the Russian army is in quite good shape. I don't want to overstate the case. It's in quite good shape, and the Ukrainian army is in dismal shape. Now, you counter by saying, but what about these weapons like the F-16s? The key point is that this is a ground war. This is a land war. You need large numbers of soldiers, and you need lots of artillery, lots of tanks, and so forth and so on. And not only do the Ukrainians not have the soldiers, they also don't have the weaponry. As I emphasized, the West does not have the artillery tubes, the artillery shells, the tanks to give to the Ukrainians to keep them in the fight in any meaningful way. While at the same time, the Russian industrial base is producing huge amounts of artillery, huge numbers of tanks, and so forth and so on. So I think that, you know, when you look at the ground balance, oh man, it's clear that the Russians are, you know, in the catbird seat, as we used to say here in the United States. Now, you talk about F-16s. At the most, the Ukrainians are going to get a handful of F-16s. F-16s are going to be basically useless against the Russians. They don't have enough of them. But furthermore, the Russians have the most sophisticated ground-based air defenses in the world. They'll shoot those F-16s out of the air very quickly. And furthermore, F-16s are not going to have that much effect on the ground war, even if they're not shot down. So there's no magic bullet here that the West can give the Ukrainians to help them pull out a victory. It's too late. The West blew it. The Ukrainians blew it. And by the way, you remember that last fall, I think it was either September or October, General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said after the Ukrainian successes in Kherson and Kharkiv, General Milley said, this is the time to negotiate. Why did he say that? Because Milley understood that this was the high watermark for the Ukrainian army. General Milley understood that moving forward, the balance would shift against the Ukrainians. But the Biden administration foolishly knocked down General Milley. They told him to stop saying that, and that we should continue to pursue the war, not negotiate at that point in time. But what Milley understood was that moving forward, the balance was going to shift against Ukraine. Its best days, Ukraine's best days, were behind them. And he, of course, proved true. And I believe that there's nothing that can change that situation at this point in time. With regard to the second question, on Gaza. I think a greater Israel has already been achieved. There is a greater Israel. The question is, what kind of political system do you have inside greater Israel? Do you have democracy? Absolutely not, because that would end up with a Palestinian state, not a Jewish state, because there are roughly equal numbers of Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and given birth rates over time, there'll be more Palestinians than Israeli Jews. So democracy, no. Ethnic cleansing, that's the hope. And I think there is a question whether or not the Israelis will be able to ethnically cleanse Gaza. I don't think they'll be able to do that. I certainly hope they won't be able to do that, but I believe they are trying to do that now. They are trying to make Gaza unlivable for the purposes of driving the Palestinians out. But you still have a greater Israel. It just contained fewer Palestinians. And if the Palestinians are not driven out, you'll continue to have an apartheid state. And that apartheid state will, of course, mainly focus on the West Bank, unless those Palestinians are driven out as well. This is not a good situation for Israel. Just quickly, with regard to the point that Hamas will be eliminated, I do not believe Hamas will be eliminated. But I believe that even if Hamas is eliminated, that another rebellious group, another group bent on rebellion or bent on liberation, whatever words you want to use, will rise to replace it. The Palestinians are not going to quit resisting. They're not going to quit resisting the Israeli occupation. They're not going to continue to submit peacefully to Israeli domination. So even if Hamas is defeated, the end result will be that the Palestinians will continue to resist over time. But again, I don't think Hamas is going to be eliminated. And I think if you look carefully at what's happening, the Israelis are having a devil of a time defeating Hamas inside of Gaza. Finally, there's the question on Iran. The first question is, do they want a bomb? I believe they do want the bomb. Why do I think that? Because if I was an Iranian leader, I would want a bomb. I've often said publicly that if I had been the president of Iran 10 years ago, Iran would already have a bomb. If I were Iranian, I'd get the bomb. The bomb is the ultimate deterrent. The United States and Israel would not be threatening to attack Iran if it had nuclear weapons. They would be much more careful in their dealings with Iran if it had a nuclear weapon. I want to be clear here. From an American point of view, and I'm sure this is true from a Turkish point of view, you don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. I'm not saying it would be good from an American point of view for Iran to have nuclear weapons, but the question on the table has to do with Iranian thinking. The gentleman asked me, does Iran want a bomb? And I'm saying that the reason I think Iran wants the bomb is because it makes eminently good strategic sense. Now, why don't they have the bomb? As you know, they're a threshold state. They're on the verge of having the bomb, and they could easily develop a bomb, or build a bomb, excuse me. They could easily build a bomb if they wanted to. But why haven't they done that? I think the answer is that the cost would be too great. I think the Russians and the Chinese, but especially the Russians and the Americans, have made it clear they do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. This is really a red line for the Americans. And I think this is one issue where the Russians and the Americans are on the same page, at least at this point in time. And I think given that the costs of getting the bomb would be great, a possible American attack, And given that they are a threshold state, you know, they're right on the verge of having the bomb, and they get some deterrent value from that, they have opted not to move forward. I think the interesting question here is, what does the situation look like moving forward, right? Do you think that Iran will, in 10 years, not have a bomb? In 20 years, not have a bomb? It's hard to say, but I would venture that if the Americans were to get into a shooting match with the Iranians, if a conflict were to break out in the Persian Gulf, for example, I think the incentives for Iran to get nuclear weapons would be such that they would be willing to absorb the costs that would go along with going down the nuclear road. So I think that, you know, given the contentious relations that exist between the United States and Iran, it is possible that we will push them to get a bomb. If I could just take this one step further. When the JCPOA was signed back in the Obama administration, this is, for those who don't know what the JCPOA is, that was the nuclear agreement between Iran, really, and the West. The question we faced after the JCPOA was signed was, how do we deal with Iran moving forward? Because the JCPOA did not last forever. So you with the JCPOA, you have shut down the Iranian nuclear program temporarily. But the question is, how do you think about the long term? My view at the time was that what the United States should do is it should work to significantly improve its relations with Iran, its diplomatic relations with Iran. And the reason is that if you improve diplomatic relations with Iran, you go a long way toward removing their incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. The reason that states acquire nuclear weapons is not because they're evil. They acquire nuclear weapons because they're scared. They think their survival is at risk, and they think that nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. So if you have a JCPOA, you've worked out a deal with the Iranians, you've shut down temporarily, at least, their nuclear weapons program, then what can you do to guarantee or maximize the prospects that Iran won't want nuclear weapons? What you could do to achieve that end is you can improve U.S.-Iranian relations. You can not eliminate the threat, but ameliorate the threat to Iran. But that's not what we did. We did exactly the opposite, even in the Obama years, and certainly in the Trump years. We kept our crosshairs on the Iranians. We were threatening them all the time. And the end result is you're just giving the Iranians a powerful incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. This is why I said, if I were an Iranian, not an American, if I were an Iranian, I would already have nuclear weapons. Or if I had been an Iranian leader, I would have already made sure that my country had nuclear weapons. Just think about North Korea. If you're a North Korean leader, you're the leader of North Korea, are you going to give up North Korean nuclear weapons? I don't think so. I think if you're a North Korean, you're going to keep your nuclear weapons. The Americans run around the world knocking off regimes. The Americans are deeply committed to regime change all over the world, especially when they're dealing with an adversarial state. North Korea must surely understand that the Americans would effect a regime change there if they could. Having North Korean nuclear weapons goes a long way towards making sure that the Americans don't try a regime change in North Korea. Doesn't the same logic apply to Iran? Don't you want to have nuclear weapons if you're Iran to make sure that the Americans are unlikely to attack you? I think the answer is yes. Anyway, all of this is to say, moving forward, I'm very nervous, and I think there is a good chance that Iran will get nuclear weapons because, again, it makes from their point of view, so much strategic sense, even if it doesn't make good strategic sense from Turkey's point of view or from America's point of view. Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. You might have observed that there was an insatiable appetite to benefit from your wisdom, and you were bombarded with questions, and you were very kind to patiently answer all of them past the time you were willing to commit to us. So we appreciate your contribution very much. And somewhere in the process, you mentioned that you might be happy to be in Ankara. I have a feeling that here we might have a competition between Ankara and Istanbul in having you, or maybe we could benefit from having you at both places. But we take your statement as a statement of interest that you might want to see us again. So thank you very much. But let me ask Ambassador Ceylan and Yenel if they would have anything else to say before I close the meeting. Ambassador
Okay, thank you, Professor. I have to assert that there's no competition as far as Ankara Policy Center and Global Relations Forum is concerned.
No, I was being facetious, actually.
I know. So we would be more than pleased and gratified if Professor Mearsheimer has the opportunity to visit Turkey and let us know that we will certainly arrange a program for him, maybe in Istanbul, maybe in Ankara. So you would be more than welcome, sir, to Turkey to continue exchanging views on a variety of issues like today. Thank you once again wholeheartedly for your contribution to the joint webinar. Thank you.
Ambassador Yenel, yes.
Well, I also like to thank very much the professor, because from the start, he was always very forthcoming to be with us. And we've just seen that he has gone beyond a lot of time. And he was very forthright, very concrete, and very realist in his assessments. So I thank him wholeheartedly for being with us and wish him a Happy New Year also to all our members as well.
Yes. Happy New Year, everyone. And Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much once again. And we'll say goodbye now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.